Hello, and welcome to the lecture for Chapter 14, Ancient Mediterranean Worlds. So, for the rest of the term, we're going to be talking about the history of art, and of course, we're going to start with the oldest art, which is prehistoric art, which means prior to history, prior to the written word. We're going to begin with the discussion of Paleolithic or Old Stone Age art. Some of the earliest art that we have has been discovered in caves. This is Lion Panel from Shabak Cave from 25,000 to 17,000 BCE. It was actually discovered in 1994, and it's just a prolific amount of images that have been found. What I want you to look at is how naturalistically these animals are represented. We talked a little bit about how the artwork from these early cave paintings, we don't know their meaning, but we do know that they were important to the people who created them, because remember, this is a hunting and gathering society. They had to take time out of their lives to go and find the spots in the caves, and then they would return to them over and over again, as you can see with how the rhinoceros horn here has been repeated over and over again. That indicates to us that there has been multiple times, multiple drawings that the artist has returned to do. So obviously these were important to the people who created them. When we're looking at cave paintings, human images are going to be rare. If they do occur, they were going to be more abstract than the animals, which tend to be a lot more naturalistic. Sometimes you'll have handprints or the outlines of handprints present, but rarely do we see the human figure. This is the horse and geometric symbol from Lascaux from 13,000 BCE. There's large and small animals found in this section with 13 different styles. But basically based on careful observation of the subject. Images, again, we don't know their exact meaning. Could be some sort of ritual or hunting image. You can see that this one we have a horse as well as some symbols surrounding it. Notice how the horse, we have some shading as well as a contour outline. And the animal is shown in profile, and you can see all four of its legs. So trying to show the animal to the best ability that they know how, so that it will be recognizable and that all the features will be present. This is the Hall of Bulls from Lascaux, 15,000 to 13,000 BCE. So here you can see kind of an overall, a little bit more of an overall view of what one of these cave paintings would look like. And you can see we have another horse here, and you can see some of them are done in different styles. So here we have more just a contour line. The horse is a contour line and shading, and then we have an animal behind this large bull that's just shading. So indicating perhaps that there were different artists that came back to this special site. So again, telling us that this is important to the artists, important to the culture, probably has some sort of ritualistic process associated with it, but very important to the culture. Again, notice how the animals are shown in profile, with the exception of the horns of the bulls. Here you can see how the horns have been turned towards the front and the rest of the bull is in profile. We can see all four legs and we can see both horns. So if they showed the profile shot of the horns, we would only see one. So again, trying to show us the clearest view of the animal so that it can be recognized for what it was. Even though it ends up being unrealistic because it's combining two different views in one time, we still get a sense, okay, it has two horns instead of just one. Hopefully that makes sense. When we see sculpture from this time period, it's going to be very small. This is the Venus of Willendorf from 23,000 BCE. This was made of stone. The name Venus of Willendorf came much later, obviously. Venus, being the Roman goddess of love, implies that this is some sort of sexual idol. We think that perhaps it is a fertility object because of the way the body has been exaggerated, particularly in the reproductive areas of the body, the breasts and the pubic area. Those things are emphasized in the image. This is pretty small. It fits in the palm of your hand. And because of that, it's thought maybe it was carried as a fertility symbol or maybe a symbol of good luck for the person who was carrying it. You'll notice that her her size is pretty exaggerated. In terms of, how a body would look in the Paleolithic era, probably not a whole lot of people looked like this. Remember, it's hunting and gathering, and we don't have like a proliferation of food to eat. So most people would not look like this. If you looked like this, you would be able to bear children, which was, of course, a really mysterious event that happened back then. Of course, they didn't have science. They didn't understand what was going on. So seeing a body like this was a sign that childbirth would be successful and that they could maintain the child after birth as well. Notice how parts of the sculpture are subordinated. So we do have arms, but we don't really see hands. And the head has just become, this hair, and you don't really even see any facial features. So this is not a portrait of an individual person, but rather a type of person, again, thought to be a fertility symbol. Here's another small sculpture piece, bison with turned head, fragmentary spear thrower from 12,000 BCE. I just wanted to show it really quickly to show you again, where even in sculpture, we have the effort to show the animal in profile, and then the head has been turned back and it's been flattened against the body. But again, you can see the profile of the head and you can see the two horns sticking out here. So even in sculpture, trying to show us the clearest view of the animal to give us the most information that they can. So that's going to bring us up to the Neolithic time period. It's known as the New Stone Age. Began around 9,000 BC and ended around 4,000 BCE. During this time period, you're going to have new stone tools being used, and farming becomes a part of life. So that's a huge transition from hunting and gathering, living in small communities, then going to farming. People are going to start to form larger communities, cities, larger cultures are going to develop and become more permanent. So these are some of the earliest centers of civilization that you can see pointed out on this map. So the first piece I just want to remind you a little bit about is Stonehenge from 2000 to 2500 BCE. And Stonehenge, remember, is a very large work. Each one of the megaliths that we're seeing, which are these large stones, are about 50 tons each. They extend into the ground. There's concentric circles of them in a post and lintel style. There have been human remains found on the site, so we're not exactly sure what this was. It is some sort of calendar because of the way the sun lines up at certain times of the year with the stones, but it's probably also some sort of ritual center. And we do know that this was very important, again, to the culture that created it, because these stones had to be quarried and then brought to the site, and it was from far, far away. It wasn't a close, location where they got these megaliths. In terms of painting, we're going to see less cave painting, and what we have is going to be done in a little bit different style. Here we can see women and cattle from a North African cave from 5000 BCE. And it's going to give us a glimpse into the culture that what created the piece. So we actually see 5 women that are gathered around cattle, indicating to us that they were the people who took care of the cattle in the culture. Other images are going to show women gathering crops and men herding, and some enclosures for these animals. So really kind of giving us a glimpse into the lives of the people that created this work. So this is a little bit different because it's showing us kind of a contemporary story or contemporary view of their culture, whereas before it was really more about the animals and maybe communicating with the animals or some sort of hunting ritual. It was all about the animals, and here we're seeing it more about the human culture that's going on. So we have a lot of clay pots from this time because food had to be stored in clay pots. When we look at these images, you'll notice that the naturalism of the Paleolithic age has been replaced by more geometrically abstract art. And the art that is done is made to enhance these objects of daily use. So these are pots that were meant to be used. When I talk about abstraction, we can look at the goat here, for example, in the main image. You can see how it's been simplified into triangles and circles. We have dogs running up above, and then you have birds with extremely long necks above that. And these are what we call registers, where you have these horizontal bands of images that surround a pot. So I just wanted to show you a comparison really quick to the Paleolithic cave paintings. You can see how much more naturalistic they are in terms of proportion and in terms of kind of the organic form of the animal, whereas in the Neolithic piece, they're much more geometric. So prehistoric art is pretty fragmented, and when we study it, we jump forward thousands of years sometimes. And that's because in order for artwork to survive, you need several things to happen. You need the artwork to be made out of a durable material. Excuse me. You need it to be made in a cooperative environment, so somewhere that is going to protect the artwork. That's why a lot of the cave paintings survive. You need a stable population, and artworks need to be made or placed in a limited access place. So some of the early civilizations that we're going to look at actually developed simultaneously in different areas. One of the first cultures to meet the criteria that I talked about before is Mesopotamia. And Mesopotamia is an area where in between the Tigris and the Euphrates River. Let me show you a map here. You can see Mesopotamia in between Tigris and Euphrates River. Going to develop around the areas of Sumer, Babylon, Ur. So that's the area that we're talking about. The first cities developed around Sumer, and we see the first culture during this time period actually leaves a written language as well as artwork. In this culture, religion and government were considered to be one, very much like we're going to see with the Egyptian culture. So there's no separation of church and state. This is Nana Ziggurat from 2100 to 2050 BCE in Ur. It's actually made of sun-dried clay on the inside and then fired bricks on the outside. So a little bit more stable material on the outside. This is actually just the base. There was originally a temple up top. So what we're seeing is actually just the remnants of how you get up to the temple. But the temple was raised in order to kind of separate it from, the everyday buildings that may have been in the city. It was dedicated to the moon god Nana, who was the protective deity of Ur. And a lot of the times when we see structures like this, they become kind of symbolic mountains. And this is a place where priests can communicate with God. So deities dwell closer to heaven, whereas heaven, it's upwards. So therefore, we're going to see these structures become as tall as they can get in order to raise that temple to the gods. So this is a sculpture piece, Raman Thicket. This was I believe it held a tabletop. It was a refined luxury item made out of pure, not pure, but precious materials, such as gold and lapis lazuli, which is a blue stone that was very important in this part of the world. You can see the naturalism present in the rendering, for example, of the legs here, although we do have some abstractions, you can see right here. But then you have this really kind of geometric, very carefully planned layout of the fur on the back of this goat. So that combination of naturalism and abstraction is something we're going to see commonly in this part of the world. This is statuettes of two worshippers from 2700 BCE. So these were found buried in a temple. They're Sumerian. And they have large, you can notice that they have large eyes, and then they have this kind of conical shaped body where we have kind of a cone shaped in both of them. One is female, you can see here, and one is male. In the female, you can actually see what their garb, both of them, you can see what their garb was during the time. The woman, one shoulder is revealed as well as one breast. So that was what they would actually have worn during the time period. So why were these created? Well, they're not portraits of people. Rather, they are meant to be stand-ins for people, stand-ins for worshipers, and their eyes are open like they are and exaggerated like they are to indicate that they're eternally awake, that they're eternally praying and giving worship to the deity. In place of the person who commissioned the sculpture. So those figures were pretty abstracted, pretty simplified, but then we look at this piece. This is head of Akkadian ruler from 2250 BCE, and you can see that it's much more naturalistic. The lifelike features of it suggest that this is an actual portrait because naturalism is rare in early art. We do have some blending of naturalism with that more formal design that can be seen, for example, in the beard, how we have these kind of repeated spirals. That's not very naturalistic, but then if you look at the way the nose is, it's very organic, the lips very soft and full, and then cheekbones, everything is rendered very naturalistically except for the beard and the hair. So that blend of naturalism and formal design, we're going to see kind of consistently during this time period, and we'll see later on in Egypt. The material that this is made out of is copper, which is an expensive material during the time, still today, which suggests that this was a ruler. So it's somebody who was important in the society, not just an everyday person. An everyday person wouldn't have been able to afford it. This is Victory Stela of Naram Sin from 2254 BCE. This was a marker in which we're seeing a hero, Naram Sin, kind of defeating the enemy, and you can tell who the leader is because of the scale. This is what we call hierarchical scale, where the most important person will be the tallest or the largest, and then the less important people will be shorter or smaller. We have landscape elements represented here. So we have the mountain, and then we can see these kind of diagonal registers that go down that indicate that there's a hill. You can see a little tree here. There's fallen soldiers underneath the leader, and you can see how they're represented very kind of crumpled looking, whereas opposed to the soldiers that are very orderly. They're shown in what we call a composite view, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, but basically where you have parts of the body that are in profile and parts of the body that are shown to the front. This is human-headed winged lion from the Assyrian culture from 883 BCE. This was located at the entrance of Assurnasirpal's palace. He was the ruler of the largest empire in the region during the time. This was meant to impress. When you see this in real life, like I stood about right here, so you can imagine the scale of it. Very, very large and meant to impress. So we have the head of a human, the body of a lion, and then the wings of a bird, all combined in this composite creature. You might notice something strange, that the animal actually looks like it has 5 legs from this viewpoint. We're not really meant to see it from this viewpoint. We're meant to either view it from the front, in which it would have 2 legs, or from the side, in which it would have 4 legs. So they're not trying to show that the animal has 5 legs. It's really meant to be seen as 2 relief sculptures, either from the front or from the side, not really necessarily from the angle that we're seeing it. Again, you have that combination of naturalism with, some of the musculature being represented, the form of the lion, and then the shape of the head and all the features, very naturalistic, combined with the unnaturalistic, more ordered and geometric representation of the beard and the feathers and the wings, for example. This is Lion Hunt from 850 BCE. This was located in Assurnasirpal's palace, and it represents the king doing a lion hunt. So basically the king is slaying the most powerful beast on earth, the lion. And why are they showing this? Well, they're showing this to represent the king as this really powerful figure, not that he actually went out and hunted lions, that he had the power to. So again, notice how we have naturalism of the lion present. Even the musculature has been kind of defined. And then we have the more unnaturalistic parts, such as the beard and the hair. So really this is meant to be seen as a demonstration of power and is propagandistic in its use. This is a low relief carving that would have been on the wall of the palace. Then we have the Ishtar Gate from Babylon from 575 BCE. This was created in the city of Babylon by the ruler Nebuchadnezzar. You can see that we actually have the rounded arch. Remember we talked about in the architecture section and how the Romans developed that. Well, the Babylons got there first, and they were the first ones to really use that architecture type. The Romans took it and made it more well-known and really became famous for it. This is made of glazed clay brick, and we're seeing animals in registers along the walls, and these are animal spirits, animal spirit guardians. And this would have been used in ceremonies. Nebuchadnezzar would have sat under it to receive his subjects. So this is the stela with the law code of Hammurabi from 1870 BCE. In it, the sun god is being represented by the seated figure, and he is giving power to the king. You can see the king here being represented. How do I know which one is the king and which one is the god? Well, it's by that hierarchical scale. So if we look at the king, he is just about as tall as, if we look at the god, he is just about as tall as the king, even though he's seated. So if he stood up, he would be much, much taller than the king. But the king is on his same level, so it's important to the hierarchy that the king is being represented as almost kind of being on eye level with him when he's seated, so that it shows that they're both very powerful. We have a composite view again, where we have part of the figure will be shown in profile, like the head here, for example, and then parts of the body will be shown as more as a frontal view, so we can see both arms here, for example. You can see it really clearly in this figure as well. This actually, all the words underneath here are recording the penalties and the laws of the culture, and this is actually where the idea of an eye for an eye comes from. So it's going to lead us into Egypt. Mesopotamia actually parallels in time Egypt, but Egypt is going to have a lot less political turmoil. They're going to have less, one king taking over for another king from a different culture, that type of thing. In fact, we're going to see a continuity of art and culture over a long span of time, over 3,000 years, that happens in the Egyptian culture. The Egyptian culture is going to be centered along the Nile River, which you can see here. And the reason for that is that the Nile would flood every year very regularly, and so they could plan their farming and their crops around the Nile River. And that's part of the reason that they were able to be so successful. So the first work we're going to look at is called the Great Sphinx from 2500 BCE. In it, you can see the head of, we think, the pharaoh Khafre, and then the body of a lion. So again, we have this that combination of power with the ruler. Okay, so the lion being a very powerful beast, and then the ruler's head is on that beast. This kind of shows us kind of the essence of stability and order that is seen in the Egyptian culture. Look at the strong horizontals of the legs, for example, really grounding the sculpture and making it feel very stable and very permanent. A lot of their artwork will convey those ideas because of the way the culture was. The culture was very stable and very enduring over time. These are the Great Pyramids. They're meant to be mountain-like and kind of point up towards the sun. The sun god Ra was their most important god. And these pyramids are actually they're actually tombs made for the pharaohs, the kings, made to preserve the body and care for the dead. Because in Egypt, their religion, their religious beliefs were such that they believed that after you die, you continue in an afterlife. That's a lot like what's on Earth. It's just an another realm. And in order to be prepared for that afterlife, you have to be buried and you have to be protected. Your body has to be protected and mummified so that you can continue on in that afterlife. And everything you need needs to be buried with you. So the people who were the most important in the culture, the kings, the pharaohs, would get the most elaborate tombs and the most protected tombs. So that's why we have these giant pyramids that develop over time. This is the Palette of Narmer from 3100 BCE. This is actually a slab for mixing cosmetics, and we're seeing the back of the palette right now. On the front, it has the little round indentions for the mixing of the cosmetics. This portrays the victory of Narmer and Higher Egypt over Lower Egypt, in which Narmer is kind of uniting Egypt into one culture, one country, I guess you could say. The composition here is ordered and balanced and divided into 3 registers. So we have the fallen enemy of Lower Egypt down below, and then up above we have the goddess being represented, and then in the middle we're actually seeing Narmer, who's defeating the enemy, who's kind of cowering below him. To the left, we have this small figure. I believe that is a representation of a scribe. So showing us again who is most important. Well, King Narmer is most important in this image. I want to talk to you a little bit more about the composite view that we can see really clearly here. So Egypt is known for using a composite view in which you have parts of the body in profile and parts of the body in frontal view. So let's start at the legs, and we can see that the legs are shown in profile. The chest then becomes a frontal view, with we can see both shoulders and we can see both arms. Then the head is turned towards a side view, but the eye on the head is actually turned towards the front. So this is a very unrealistic way of representing the human body. I mean, if you try and stand like that, you're not going to be able to very well. And you definitely can't turn your eye to the side whenever you're facing one way. So why did they do this? Well, it's a way of showing completely the human body, much like we saw when we were looking at Neolithic art and Paleolithic art and the way that they were representing animals. They want to show us completely what the figure looks like. And if we see the eye from the side, we really can't see the shape of the eye very well. So that gives us an idea as to why they're using this composite view. And it also tends to make it seem very stiff and very unmoving. And again, you can see that balance and stability become important as a representation of Egyptian culture itself. So here we have a larger sculpture, life-size sculpture of a king and his wife from 2532 to 2510 BCE. So here we can see attention to human anatomy, but we still see it in this overall geometric scheme. When the Egyptians carved or when they painted, they used a grid-like system. So for example, like the feet would be 2 blocks long, the legs would be such, I don't know, like 4 blocks, you know, the bottom leg would be 4 blocks long, etc. Um, so what that does is it gives it this overall kind of scheme, but at the same time, we get a lot of naturalism. Like if you look at the chest of the king, for example, very organic, very soft in the way that it's been carved. The posture that we're seeing here with the king, you can see his arms straight down by his side, one leg forward, one leg back. And the queen here, to some extent, has one leg forward, one leg back. She doesn't have her arms down by her sides. Her arms are around her husband to show unity. But that kind of stiff posture of the king is something that we'll see over and over again in Egyptian art. So this is a sculpture of a seated scribe from 2450 BCE. And the scribes were actually a high court official. They were important people in the Egyptian society. They were professional writers, and the fact that they could write and read demanded respect. And the way that they're portrayed here actually shows them in a very respectful way. Very naturalistically done. You can see the body type is almost kind of like you have like a little pooch here, so slightly overweight maybe, but they portrayed them like this because it shows that their life is not full of hard labor. They had a lifestyle that they used their brain and their skills over their more physical attributes, and so that rendering of that naturalistic quality is something that was seen as a kind of tribute to the scribes. What's really interesting about this piece is that you actually see some of the original paint that was left over. So keep in mind when we're looking at a lot of these pieces from this really early time period, these were originally painted. So they're not always going to be the blank stone that you see in a lot of these because the paint has worn away. They were originally painted in very lifelike colors. This is the funerary temple of Hatshepsut from 1460 BCE. So this was an element in a royal funerary complex, and it was actually carved out of the mountain you can see behind it. So this was not necessarily built, but carved into the structure. And it was created for the one female pharaoh, Hatshepsut. 200 statues once occupied the space, but after her rule, a lot of her statues and artwork was destroyed because her rule was kind of controversial, again, being the only female pharaoh. This is a fragment of a wall painting from the tomb of Nebenum from 1450 BCE. In it, we're seeing a hunting scene being depicted. Notice how the figures, again, are shown in that really stylized composite view, but then the animals are shown in a really naturalistic way, where you can see the feathers on the tail of this bird, for example. You can see the texture of this animal. You can see even the reeds of the papyrus stalks here and the kind of flowers that are budding up above. And then that's contrasted with that really stiff kind of composite view of the figures. So this is showing us kind of a lot of what would have been on the inside of tombs. Scenes like this, scenes portraying daily life, scenes portraying things that they would want to do in the afterlife. If you wanted to do it, you had to have a painting or sculpture of it so that you could do it in the afterlife. We're seeing the king being represented here as the largest, and then he's got his wife and his child here. And you'll notice how they're smaller. They're also a different skin tone. Women will be shown as being lighter in skin tone than men. You'll also notice how he has a youthful kind of physically fit body. That's because that's going to be the body in the afterlife. So whatever body you want in the afterlife, you have to have represented in the artwork. So that's going to bring us into the Amarna period in Egypt, which happened around 1353 BCE. This was when we had the rule of Amenhotep IV, also known as Akhenaten, which he changed his name to. During this time period, there was a large shift in Egyptian culture, which up to this point, a couple thousand years in, had been very stable, a belief in multiple gods. Their belief in the afterlife was the same for that amount of time. And Akhenaten comes and tries to change the belief from polytheistic to monotheistic, so trying to change it from multiple gods to a belief in one god. He also changed the art to be more naturalistic, but you're going to see some exaggerations in other ways in the artwork. This is an image of his queen, Queen Nefertiti. It's quite well known, and she was considered to be a famous beauty. And you can see that and represented in how her face looks. Very beautiful. Notice the long, elongated neck here. That's something that you'll see throughout the Amarna period. So this is Akhenaten and his family. So it's a low relief carving in which we're seeing the pharaoh with his family. It's an intimate domestic scene in which you're seeing a lot of tenderness shown between the family members, which is not something you would have seen before. If we go back, let me go back a couple slides here. We see much more of a formal relationship between the man and the woman and the child. Here we have the children sitting on the lap of the mother, kind of crawling all over her. The father's cuddling and kissing one of the children there. You'll notice that the body type of the pharaoh is very different from what we would have seen. So if you look at his body, he's got a narrow waist, wide hips, narrow shoulders, and he's got like a little pooch here. So that naturalistic rendering was something that was quite different, and possibly how he actually looked in his real life. It's not known whether he actually had physical abnormalities. Like if you look at his neck, very elongated. If you look at his head, very large. It's thought that it's possible that he had physical abnormalities because of the inbreeding that happened in the royal family. And you can see the elongated skulls of the children here being represented as well. So it's possible that's what he actually looked like and wanted that represented in the artwork of the time period. But what's really different here is the tenderness, the sense of, a humanity within these Amarna period artworks. Didn't last long. So after Akhenaten dies, he actually gets taken over, his reign gets taken over by Tutankhamun. And Tutankhamun was his son-in-law. And he didn't rule for very long. He died when he was around 18, I believe. And he took everything kind of back to the more traditional ways of representation and as well as religion, going back to the polytheistic religion. His tomb was actually discovered in 1922 intact. I think he's the only pharaoh whose tomb that we've found has been intact, because most of the time grave robbers will get to them and steal all the gold and jewels and everything out of it. But because he was somewhat of an unimportant king, his tomb was kind of hidden a little bit better. It wasn't such a big, ornate deal. And because of that, it survived over time. And so we found inside precious materials such as alabaster, stones, and gold. Here we have his burial mass. So this would have been over his mummy. And you can see a lot of what I was just talking about, that that gold as well as the precious stones that are embedded in it. You can see here. Naturalistic face, more kind of abstracted geometric beard, for example. So back to the more traditional ways of blending naturalism and abstraction in Egyptian art. This is another piece that was found in his tomb. This is the innermost coffin of Tutankhamun. And this was made out of solid gold. When they found his coffin, it was a gigantic box, and inside of it there were 3 boxes, and then there were 3 human-shaped coffins, and they got down to the innermost one, and they were like, "Oh, this is why it's so heavy. This is solid gold." So very, very heavy, and very, very rich and beautiful. And so this is the tomb of a somewhat unimportant king. Imagine what the important kings got. So Egypt had over 3,000 years of reign, but the younger cultures of Greece and Rome eventually conquered Egypt. But during the time period that we see Egypt um, reigning and blossoming and really coming to, fruition, we have the Aegean cultures also developing. So the Aegean culture is going to be located around Greece. We have the island Crete here. The mainland of Greece is also going to be some of what we're talking about here. But there's three major cultures that we're going to talk about: the Cycladic, the Minoan, and the Mycenaean. So the Cycladic culture was somewhat of a mystery. We don't have a lot of art from the Cycladic culture. This is a statuette of a woman from 2600 to 2400 BCE. And in it, we're seeing a very simplified, abstract, geometric figure. And this is very common in Cycladic art. And I don't have a side shot here, but they're very thin. So they're made to lay prone. They're made to lay down rather than standing up. It's thought that this could be some sort of fertility symbol. Again, we have the breast and the pubic area kind of being represented, where we have the absence of the human, or I'm sorry, the facial features, for example. But this type of art, it actually has a very modern feel, because artists like Picasso, for example, would look at it and use what they saw in their own modern artwork. So the Minoan culture lived on the island of Crete, and it was centered around the city of Knossos. This is where the myth of the Minotaur came from. And it was a culture that was a very peaceful culture. It was a very wealthy culture. They relied on the marine life surrounding their island for their wealth. So they would fish and get wealth that way. And because of that, there things like arts, sports, those kinds of things that aren't essential to a civilization actually became very important to them, because they had the amount of money that you would need to make those things more important. So they weren't always dealing with how are we going to survive to the next day. They were able to develop the arts and the sports. So this is the Palace of Knossos. It's a reconstruction of it. It was not found in this state when it was discovered. But you can see, looking at the reconstruction, that it has multiple levels. Okay, so 3 stories here. It was painted. You had murals on the inside, as well as the columns would have been painted. The columns resembled Doric Greek columns in the way that you have the simple flared capital. But then you'll notice how it's flared. That's an unusual quality. We're not going to see that. We're not going to see that in Greek architecture. This is a fresco painting called Toreador fresco from 1500 BCE. The bull was a revered animal in Minoan culture, and we actually see kind of a precursor to bullfighting here, where we are actually seeing a sporting event in which one figure is grabbing the horns, leaping over the bull, and then landing on the other side of the bull. Notice the contrast between this large bull and the lithe figures, very athletic figures being shown. You're going to see a lot more movement in the Minoan figures than you would have seen in Greek figures, or Egyptian figures, for example. Like if you look at this figure, how the legs are bent and the back is bent, and you can really get a sense of the movement of the figure. You still have somewhat of a composite view, although the shoulders here are shown in profile. The eye is still shown facing the front. I just really love this piece, so I wanted to include it. This is Landscape with Swallows from 1650 BCE. And so this is just one of the examples of the fresco paintings that would have adorned the walls of the Palace of Knossos. And this is a really interesting work because it is a landscape. We haven't really seen that before. It's usually a depiction of animals or humans, and we do have some animals here. We have the little birds, but they are really secondary to the landscape, which is this very whimsical, hilly landscape with whimsical plants and the primary colors being used. So everything is very playful and lighthearted. And again, that just kind of goes back to the culture of the Minoans. That continued on into their pottery. This is marine style octopus jar, which you can see an octopus that's kind of surrounding the jar. If we saw the other side of this, we'd actually see the end of the tentacles wrapping around this rounded jar. And so this idea between surface and form is a little bit different here than we had, for example, with the registers. You know, when you divide the pot into registers, you're really viewing it as more of a two-dimensional surface, whereas here, because the tentacles are wrapping around the pot and it's different from all angles, they're really viewing it more as a three-dimensional object. So moving on to the Mycenaean culture, which were really kind of the opposite of the Minoans. They were much more warlike culture. They relied on their army for their power rather than their riches. They were known for their elaborate burial costumes and tombs, similar to what we would have seen in Egypt. This is Rhyton in the shape of a lion's head. In it, we can see their excellent craftsmanship, and they were known for their goldsmithing. So you can see a lot of the detail in the lion's head. You know, you can see the mane being represented as well as all of the little details in the lion's head. This is Lion Gate from the Mycenaean culture from 1300 to BCE. And in it, you can see a sense of their architecture, which is very different from the Minoans. Remember, they had multiple levels. The Mycenaeans are going to instead use just a massive kind of construction where we have these massive boulders being stacked on each other. You can see a post and lintel opening here with a keystone up above it to relieve the weight of the stone, kind of travels down to the posts. So that's going to lead us into the Greek culture. And this time period in art history is actually known as the classical time period within Western culture. And the term classical indicates that it's of the highest quality and the best of its kind. So, of course, this is kind of a biased viewpoint of Greek art. But art and architecture strive to achieve its best during this time period, and was really seen as developing kind of the best so far in civilization, and will really be looked back at in Western art as being kind of this pinnacle of art and architecture. They're going to assimilate art from Egypt as well as the Near East, the Aegean culture. In the culture of the Greeks, we're going to have sophistication. They were the first to study nature as well as the purpose of art. They were the first democratic society, and really the first to kind of study the humanities, if you will. We don't have a lot of painting from this time period. This is a map where you can see the area that we're going to be talking about right here. Athens is right here. So we don't have a lot of painting from this time period because, well, any painting, because none of it survived. Instead, what we have are a large number of painted terracotta vessels that can kind of give us a little bit of a hint as to what painting might have looked like during the time period. This is a crater from the 8th century BCE. It was used for wine, and objects like this would have been seen as tombstones as well. So they had a very different kind of understanding of life and death than the Egyptians did. For example, they just believed that death was death, and the next world was really of little interest. So a lot of the times they would just have simple graves marked with pieces like this. This is actually showing a funeral procession. You can see the deceased right here being drawn by horses, and then you can see all the mourners surrounding them. Notice how the human figures are very geometric. This is called the geometric style because we have a lot of geometry within the human figures as well as the other decoration that surrounds it. Notice how this pot is divided into registers, so these horizontal bands, hundreds of them, up and down the pot. So that kind of indicates to us that they haven't gotten kind of as far into the three-dimensionality as we would have seen in the Minoan culture, for example. But their interest in sculpture developed by the influence of Egypt. This is a life-size Kouros from 580 BCE. And I wanted to show you and compare it to what we saw in Egypt. And you can see some similarities. So the similarities are that the figures are idealized, that they are, you know, kind of the perfect male body, that one foot is forward, one foot is back in both. The arms are straight down by the sides, the face is facing straight forward. But the main difference is that the Greek piece is nude, whereas the Egyptian piece is going to be clothed. You'll also notice that the Greek piece is free from the stone, whereas the Egyptian piece is still attached to the background. So this idea of freestanding is going to become very important in the Greek culture. This was one of thousands of statues placed as offerings in sanctuaries, and they were there to kind of honor some individual achievement, but they're not meant to be portraits, unlike the Egyptian piece. So we'll come back to some of these, some of these differences and talk about a little bit more about why we see these differences as we go through Greek art. So this is Spear Bearer by Polykleitos from 450 BCE. You can see it's gone from being pretty stiff. You still have some stylization, like in the kneecaps, for example. The hair is very stylized, which means, it's been abstracted. And then we come to Polykleitos, which is about 130 years later, which, if you think about Egyptian art, it stayed the same for 3,000 years pretty much. And then Greek art is changing quite dramatically within 150 years. So this is increasingly naturalistic, it's idealized, and the body is shown in movement. So as opposed to the earlier Kouros that we saw, where it's very static, very still, very stable, here we actually see what we call contrapposto, which is this S curve to the body, where you have one leg straight, one arm straight, one leg bent, one arm bent, and then the head will be turned and the hips will be tilted. And that kind of stance was developed to show the ability of movement. So they're trying to get these figures to be more and more naturalistic, and we'll come back to that idea in just a moment. So this is another ceramic piece. This is amphora with gymnasium scene from 520 BCE. So we can see that naturalism developed pretty quickly. This was only made 60 years after the Kouros statue. This is called red figure style because the figures are shown in red and the background is in black. You can see how the figures are proportionate. There's a lot more movement being shown as these figures are kind of wrestling each other. Notice how the men are nude, and then we have the one female goddess over here. She's fully clothed. That's something that's very typical in Greek art. The male body was really revered and meant to be admired in the culture, whereas the female body had to be more hidden. So this is Warrior A from 450 BC. This is done during the classical time period in Greek art, which happened between 480 and 323 BCE. And again, we can see that contrapposto. So I just want to emphasize again where we have one leg straight, one arm bent, one leg bent, head to the side, and hips tilted. And what that does is it makes it feel like the statue could take a step at any time. This is one of two warrior sculptures that were found that are original Greek statues. A lot of the statues that we look at when we study Greek art are actually Roman copies of Greek originals that were then melted down. A lot of Greek statues would have been made out of metal, like what we're seeing here. So originally would have been modeled, then it would have been made into a mold, and then it would have been cast into metal. So it's a pretty amazing process and feat that they were able to accomplish. Look at the amount of naturalism that's present here. We don't really have that abstraction anymore, even in the hair and the beard. It's much more naturalistic and flowing. The body has been idealized. You can see the musculature underneath the skin is being revealed. And the body is idealized in such a way that it actually goes beyond reality. It's what I mean by that is like the legs, for example, are exactly half the body, which in reality they are not. So the hip line has been raised. Other things like in the back, which we can't see from here, but in the back there's a bone removed at the base of the spine to make the divide between the back really apparent. So just things like that they're trying to make this as realistic as possible. So why would they do that? Well, it has to do with their religion, actually. Their religion was based on the belief of multiple gods, but their gods had perfect human bodies. So they were just like humans, except for their bodies were perfect. So they still had flaws and they still, had emotions and everything, but their bodies would have been perfect. And so part of Greek culture was striving for perfection in bodies. And in the male body, that meant being muscular and fit. And so that's represented in their sculptures. They wanted their sculptures to be as lifelike and as naturalistic as possible, but also idealized so that they could be godlike. In their architecture, we're going to see them develop three specific orders, which we talked about in the architecture section. But just to remind you, Doric, Ionic, and Corinthian. They're not necessarily chronological. They existed at the same time and were just done kind of in different parts of the country. This is the Parthenon from 447 BCE, and what we're seeing is what remains of the Parthenon, of course. This was built by Phidias during the reconstruction of Athens by Pericles. Athens was seen as the artistic and philosophic center of Greece, and this particular temple would have been dedicated to Athena Parthenos, who was the warrior maiden goddess. It's made from post and lintel construction, so you can see the posts and then the lintel going around the structure. And they got that from Egypt and Egyptian architecture. This type of temple is a Doric temple. You can see that from the simple flared capital. And then you don't have a base of the capital. You don't have a base of the column, and then you have this fluted look to the column as well. This was really seen as a model of perfection to European artists for a long time. Part of the reason is that the architects actually took into consideration optical illusions that would happen. So for example, the steps here, if you look, or if you go and measure them, you can't really see it. If you go and measure them, they actually raise up slightly in the middle because our eye, when we see long horizontal lines like this, they tend to droop in the middle, just optically illusion, it's an optical illusion. So to account for that, they made the steps raised a little bit. They also made the corner columns be wider than the rest of the columns because they knew that they would be hit on two sides by light instead of just one side by light. And so that would make them appear to be thinner. So because of these kinds of things, it's really seen as this model of perfection to a lot of later European artists. So a lot of this temple is missing. So we can see the pediment up above is completely gone. And so I just wanted to talk to you a little bit about what that may have looked like. So we're going to kind of look at a model of a comparison between the Doric and the Ionic orders so that you can see some of these parts that are missing from the Parthenon. So the Parthenon, like I said, is a Doric building, and it has the Doric column, and then up above in the frieze, it's going to have triglyphs and metopes. And then up above, you're going to have the pediment, which is going to be this triangular section that's filled with sculpture. In the Ionic order, you're going to see the main difference will be the column, which you can tell right away if it's got a scrolled capital that it's Ionic. So this is not from the Parthenon. This is from the Temple of Zeus from Olympia. But I wanted to show it because this kind of illustrates what the pediment may have looked like, or at least resembled in some way on the Parthenon. So you can see how the figures are made to fit into the triangular shape of the pediment. So, for example, the figures in the corners are laying down, and then as you go up, you see the figures kneeling. Then you have a horse here representing a little bit of the height difference. And then as you go towards the middle, you have a hierarchical scale being used, and Zeus would have been in the middle as being the most important god. So this sculpture, the Three Goddesses, is actually from the Parthenon pediment. This was from the far right side of the pediment, and you can see how it gets shorter and shorter as it goes down, so it fit right into that corner of the triangle. And then as you go up, they're going to get taller and taller. This is a great example of classical sculpture, and in particular what a female figure would have been represented like. So remember, a lot of the men, or all of the men, are going to be nude, whereas the female figures are going to be fully clothed. Even goddesses are fully clothed, but they're clothed in such a way that it reveals the body underneath. So this is what we call the wet drapery technique, where it looks like the figures are actually soaked in water and you can see the body underneath. But you can definitely see that they have a lot of clothing on. And in fact, they have so much, it's kind of wrapped around her leg here, and it's piled up. You can imagine if she stood, there would be so much fabric there. So that drapery is really important as it reveals the body underneath. So that's going to lead us into the Hellenistic time period and Greek art, which happens around 323 BCE. This is Venus de Milo from 150 BCE. So we do see some continuation of the classical style, such as the emphasis on balance and restraint. She was the goddess of love, beauty, and fertility. But here we're beginning to see that female nudity is allowed. So during the Hellenistic time period, you're going to see female nudity, but only if it's a goddess or a mythological figure. So you're not going to see like an everyday woman being represented nude. She was really seen as the ideal of female beauty. This is Nike of Samothrace, where we see some other qualities of Hellenistic art. And really the overthrow of the classical style. So here we have much more dramatic, like if you look at the fabric kind of surrounding her leg, look at how dramatically she's stepping forward. Her torso's thrust forward, her wings are thrust backward. So there's a lot of drama in the later Hellenistic time period, which we can also see here in the Laocoon group from the 1st century BCE. So that interest in kind of being subtle and having some restraint is really gone. We see a lot of emotion present here. The figures are stepping off the pedestal into the viewer's space. We're seeing the depiction of the death of Laocoon, who is the priest god Apollo, who angered the gods, as well as his sons being killed by the serpent. So it's very theatrical. If you look at the facial expression, for example, of Laocoon, you can see that he is in utter anguish, terror, and that type of facial expression is not something that we would have seen during the classical time period. Going to lead us into our last culture that we're going to look at in chapter 14, and that is the Roman culture. So in 27 BCE, Rome officially became an empire under Augustus, the Emperor Augustus. And Roman culture still affects our culture, such as our law and government, our calendar, some of our festivals, religions, and languages. In Rome, they greatly admired Greek art, but they also wanted to change some of the things that they saw in Greek art to reflect more of their own culture. This is Head of an Old Man from 25 BCE. In it, you can see that there's a high degree of individuality as well as observed and recorded details. And those details are not necessarily perfect, right? So we have wrinkles on the face, we have laugh lines around the eyes, the forehead is completely wrinkled. So showing the age of the figure is really important. And these were really portraits of people, so they would be actual family members, for example. You would have, instead of like a photograph taken, you would have a sculpture bust made of a family member, and then you would have that forever to kind of remember that family member. And so they wanted it to be as realistic as possible, and they really venerated age and wisdom in the Roman culture. In fact, part of their government was called senators because they were seniors. They were supposed to be more intellectual and, aged and wise. So that type of thing was very prized in the Roman culture. You can see that in this piece as well, double portrait from the 1st century BCE. So they excelled in lifelike portraits of real people. You're not going to see as much idealization, so the figures are not going to be, perfect bodies and perfect faces. Instead, you're going to see the lined, aged face of the man who's revealing his age, and then he's got a more youthful wife here. The wife clasped the hands of the man in a kind of a supportive gesture, so showing some emotion between the figures, and it kind of allows us to connect a little bit more with the figures that are being represented. Where we do see idealization is with the representation of the rulers. This is a portrait of Marcus Aurelius. The Romans really invented the equestrian portrait in the West. And so we see a leader here on horseback. And you'll notice that some parts of this have been exaggerated to increase the power of the leader. So if you look at the scale, for example, if you look at how tall he would be when he stands, he would be probably much taller than the horse, which in reality is not the case. So his scale has been exaggerated to exaggerate his power over the horse, but also over his the people that he's ruling. We do have some painting that survives from the Roman culture. This is painting from Villa of the Mysteries from 50 BCE. And in it, you actually get a sense of naturalism. You get a sense of space and depth. So you can see, for example, that there is some effort to show perspective as, like, for example, this pedestal kind of goes back into space. You have light to dark shading on the figures that make it feel very three-dimensional and naturalistic. The proportion of the figures is correct. You also have an effort of design. As you can see, the lines in the background kind of divide this into separate little sections, and each section kind of has its own little composition. So Romans were very far developed in terms of painting, and it's thought that they learned a lot of that from Greek artists. Part of the reason that we have Roman painting left is because of the eruption of Mount Vesuvius on Pompeii, that actually covered the entire city with ash and preserved it, so that we could come much, much later, thousands of years later, and excavate it, and that's how we have examples of Roman painting left. Here's another one, in which you can get a sense of how they're trying to reveal depth and using perspective in their paintings. Now you'll notice that it's not linear perspective in this case. There are some Roman paintings that do employ linear perspective. So it's actually a Renaissance technique that the Romans actually started. Then lastly, I wanted to talk to you about the Colosseum. The Romans are best known for their architecture, and the Colosseum is a great example of kind of the pinnacle of their architecture. So the Colosseum was an amphitheater for gladiator games, so really kind of the equivalent of today's big stadium, like football stadiums. It has 3 tiers of arches, and you can see each arch has a column on the outside. And if you look closely, you can see that it goes from Doric, Ionic, and then Corinthian. So there's this progression as you move up to the more complicated order. Each arch is directly above the one below it. And so there's a sense of order and math and being very logical and coherent. And that's something that Roman architecture is known for. So the Roman Empire expanded over many countries and cultures. The subjects that the Romans took over, a lot of the times they were able to keep their own culture and just assimilate into the Roman culture as well. So we will continue on with our discussion of art history and what happened after the Roman Empire diminished in the next chapter.